let's go on to Andrew. Andrew Lawson, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Jamie, and good afternoon to you all. My apologies for coming in late. I flew in last night from Peru and had to spend the night in Madrid, so I flew in this morning. But I'm here, and I'm very pleased in particular to have listened to Gundula's presentation, which I think is very interesting. And I very much take Jamie's point that it's great that we've got some evidence and we're talking about it. But I want to be a little bit polemical, because I don't think that any of us are really capturing the causes of some of these problems very accurately. I think the evidence that we have from Kenya clearly shows that resources at the front line are insufficient, and they show that there is a horizontal allocation which is highly unequal. That seems indisputable, and those are both very highly relevant facts. We also know from other data that there are issues of transparency. There may be issues of participation. It's interesting, Felipe's presentation just now suggested that at least Uganda seems to score better than Kenya. So perhaps there is more participation than we're seeing. But I think sometimes we're making a bit of a leap of faith in thinking that we're seeing inequality, we're seeing a lack of resources. Would that be solved by more transparency, more participation, and indeed more decentralization? I would put to you a different hypothesis, which is that actually the history of the way in which local governments have been built up, in particular in Anglophone Africa, has a big impact on the way in which resources are used and their ability even to receive resources. One key thing we've noticed is there's a big difference in non-wage allocations. That came across clearly from Gundula's presentation. But non-wage allocations are in most cases driven by wage allocations. Where you have teachers, you will also get textbooks. Where you don't have teachers, you won't get textbooks. By the same line of reasoning, where you don't have nurses and medical assistants, you won't get so many medicines. And wage allocations themselves tend to be driven by the allocation of facilities. If a local government does not have enough schools, well, it's not going to get enough teachers. And if it doesn't have enough teachers, it won't have enough of a non-wage allocation. And I think in quite a number of these countries, the core problem comes from the difficulty in addressing the infrastructure gap. And as we noted from Gundula's presentation, there is data suggesting that there are problems with procurement. There are problems in the management of investment, and local level differences in capacity have a big impact upon that. So what may be happening, and this is really just a hypothesis, is that resources have been allocated to these less capable, poorer local governments. They've been unable to spend them on the infrastructure they were hoping to spend them on. And as a consequence, they can't recruit the people they need. And as a consequence, they don't get the budgets that they ought to get if we just looked at it on a per capita basis. So, and I don't know Uganda well enough to know how far this hypothesis holds true there. But I've worked quite a bit in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and I know that in those countries, the problem of inequality in infrastructure allocation very much drives the other inequalities we see in the rest of the budget. Would we solve it by a decentralization? Again, I don't think so, because the decentralization is hampered by exactly these capacity differences that we're seeing. In other words, if the poorer, less advantaged areas are unable to build schools, build health centers, build water facilities that are needed, they won't get the budgets they need. And so potentially one might need an intervention of a different kind. I mean, I don't know how many of you have spent time in the former Soviet Union, but one of the things that the former Soviet Union was good at doing was getting infrastructure built around the country. You do see universities, schools, hospitals very well spread out around the country because there was a centralized process of infrastructure building. Now, how far that has continued and how far things have remained equal since is another question. But I put it to you that perhaps a combination of centralized efforts to build up infrastructure, to equalize infrastructure as a first stage towards greater devolution, greater local participation might be a way forward. And I mean, by way of analogy, I've just come back from Peru. Peru receives a lot of mining royalties, and they have a structure of division of mining royalties which allocate high proportions of those royalties to local communities. And in principle, those local communities have the capability to spend it on a range of investments, and there's a highly participatory process for that to happen. But we again get the same problem that I'm mentioning here, that the poorer regions are unable to spend their royalties properly. And of course, there's rules about how they should be spent. Maybe the rules are a bit too strict. That's another question. But what is happening is that despite having pots of money available for improving their infrastructure, they're struggling to be able to do that. So I think this infrastructure question lies at the heart of some of these problems and is worth looking at more carefully. One other thing I want to say, just as a research idea, it struck me that from ODI's work, there would be scope for doing more causal analysis, taking things forward. You know, if one was able to break up the local government, picking up on one of the points that Seth was making, looking at urban-rural differences, looking at when these local governments were founded. Is it true that the local governments that have existed for longer are better able to receive resources now? I think if we were able to introduce other factors such as urban-rural, such as time of setup of the local government, other things as well, distance from the capital, those other kinds of indicators, I think we'd be able to investigate more carefully some of the causes of these inequalities we're seeing. But thanks very much anyway for the presentation. I think it's been very interesting. Thank you.